I'm Julia Coakley, Director of Operations, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon, which is being delivered by Paracode. Before handing over to our presenter today, I'd just like to cover off a few housekeeping points. Please ensure your microphone and camera is off, and if you'd like to ask a question, please drop it into the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We will put the questions that you have to Will during the presentation. The more questions, the better. This presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development, and the recording will be available both on the MGAA YouTube channel and in your dashboard as an MGAA user member. You will be sent a feedback survey post-event, and I really do urge you to take your time to complete that. It is the perfect way for us to understand what sort of market briefings we're delivering to our membership and whether we're hitting the mark and making sure that we're delivering what you want to hear about. So today's market briefing is being delivered by Paracode. I'd like to introduce Will Prest, Product Manager. Will has a keen passion for sailing, and he started his career as a deck officer in the Merchant Navy before coming ashore to work as a policy administrator for a specialist equine MGA and broker. During that time, he developed an in-depth insurance expertise, which led Will to develop an innovative insurance software system designed specifically to benefit MGAs. The knock-on success of this ultimately grew into Paracode, where Will currently heads up the product team, defining the product roadmap and working alongside Paracode's customers, dedicating his time to bring their products to market. He shares his insight as the voice of the customer, advising the development of the product. Will has also helped to launch a specialist leisure marine MGA, providing commercial products to marine businesses and yacht insurance to consumers. So I'll hand over to Will.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining. It's really appreciated for you to take the time to do this. Just to cover off the learning objectives for this session. So what we're going to be looking at first is what I call the underwriting spectrum, and I'm sure many of you will recognise the concept as I'm describing it. It's basically describing the different styles of underwriting that people adopt, and we'll be looking at why they adopt those different styles of underwriting. We'll also be looking at which lines of business have used data more predominantly than others to drive their underwriting, and look at why that is, and then finally we'll understand how the lines of business that have traditionally not used data could now leverage data to get a better underwriting outcome. I'd also like to sort of apologise up front. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so please bear with me on that front. So if we look at what an underwriter does, broadly, I think there's three categories of activity that are key to what an underwriter does. The first thing an underwriter does is they decide what risks they want to accept and what risks they don't. If they do then decide to accept a risk, they are then looking at what terms and conditions they want to impose on a risk. So that will be what levels of cover apply, what excesses apply, what exclusions apply. And then finally, they're going to be looking at what price they want to charge for that risk. And one of the key things I think we need to bear in mind in this session is that underwriting isn't really a singular activity. It's very specific to the market you're in and the risks you're dealing with, which is what makes it really interesting from my perspective, where I'm building people's insurance products, building their underwriting processes in the background. So if we now take those concepts and look at the underwriting spectrum, what I think of as the underwriting spectrum is it's all the different ways in which people can underwrite different insurance products. Now, all these ways are legitimate. No ways, there's not one way that's sort of superior to the others. It's really contextualized by the type of risk you're dealing with and the market that you're operating in. So starting at the left, we've got what I sort of describe as manual or high-touch underwriting. In that environment, every risk is basically unique, and it needs to be assessed on its own merits. And as such, there's not a huge volume of data that you can bring when you're looking at a particular risk to try and compare it to other risks. Moving slightly further to right, you've got what I describe as the light touch model. That's typically where you have some amount of data about a particular risk, and you might have suggested rates on how you might want to rate that risk and what terms you apply, but ultimately each risk is still going to be considered on its own merits and effectively will be manually underwritten, but you've got a suggestion of where you think you want to go. In the middle of the spectrum, you've got what I suppose I call tabular or rate table driven underwriting. That's effectively saying, does the risk fit these criteria? If yes, it gets that rate with that terms and conditions, that exclusions, conditions, etc. That in the middle is where I think a lot of MGAs sit, and I think it's quite a nice place to be, because you are getting a lot. You've got enough data about the risk you're underwriting to make an informed decision about what terms and conditions and pricing you're going to apply. You also have the opportunity, sort of with your referral and acceptance criteria, to define what's in scope of that rate table underwriting and what falls out of scope of that. And that's sort of, if something's in scope, it gets a rate table rate, and if it then falls out of scope, if it's referred, it then moves back to the left towards the light touch of a high touch underwriting style. So a single risk might actually sit on multiple places on the spectrum in terms of underwriting. Further to the right of rate table underwriting, you've got machine learning. So this sort of takes rate table underwriting and adds a bit more. So with machine learning, what you're typically doing is you have a much larger data set than you might just have for a rate table underwriting approach. And you're then able to apply algorithmic learning models to determine what the most appropriate terms and conditions and pricing are to apply. Typically, in my experience, machine learning driven underwriting is generally reserved for the larger companies, because there's a bigger cost upfront to using it. And I think one of the future benefits that small MGAs are going to have, and I come, I suppose, from a small MGA background, is that with sort of movements in technology, more people are going to be able to access machine learning style underwriting models that they can then use in their business, and it won't just be the preserve of sort of the big lines of business and the big insurers and big MGAs. And then at the very far right, I've got artificial intelligence with some question marks. I mean, there's artificial intelligence is a huge subject, and I'm certainly no expert on it. But I suppose, from my perspective, the idea that machine learning and artificial intelligence are closely related, and I think most people in the near term, in the next 5 to 10 years, are probably going to move towards machine learning. I think very few people are going to move towards true artificial intelligence. I suppose the reason I say that is if anyone's played around with something like ChatGPT, where you can ask a lot of questions. I was actually experimenting with it yesterday to see if it could suggest to me some pricing for my car. How much would it cost to insure my car? And it was struggling to give me a sensible answer. So I still think, although ChatGPT is an experimental model, I think there'll be a lot of derivative commercial solutions will come out of that kind of ChatGPT type technology. I think to get to a true artificial intelligence where you can say, here's a book of business, tell me what terms and conditions and rates I should be charging on it, and just crack on. I think that is somewhere where, and really there'll still be a huge amount of human input using basically artificial intelligence to do all the boring administrative tasks. But to get to true artificial intelligence underwriting, I think we're quite a long way away from that. And I think that's probably a good thing ultimately, because otherwise we might all be out of a job. Moving on, so why do different styles of underwriting exist? I think for me, there's 3 core reasons, and I've got some images here just to sort of explain that. On the left, we've got a word cloud for big data. So the first one is really how much data do you have? And this can vary on how long you've been in business, how big the line of business is you're dealing with in terms of sort of absolute market share and what share you have of that market, and how much data you actually collect. My first company I worked for was Specialist Equine MGA. We were using 1990s technology with a lot of paper proposal forms. So in the business, there was a huge amount of data, but it was all unstructured and it was all unusable because it was based in paper form and it wasn't in an easily accessible database. So there's quite a lot. When you're looking at data, it's not just about the volume of data, it's the quality of the structural data. It's probably your biggest concern, and also whether it's relevant as well. In the middle, we've got a picture of some different types of things we might want to insure, some different risks. So horses, the key thing about horses is horses are generally insured as effectively as pet insurance, so it's like a medical risk. Each horse is genuinely unique, and what really tells you whether there's going to be a claim on that horse or not, it's two things. One's its age, but probably more importantly is what claims it's had previously. Because generally, if a horse injures itself once, it's going to injure itself again in a related manner. So it's very difficult to look at horses as a homogeneous risk, because each one's quite unique. On the right there, we've got a car. So in the UK, car insurance, it's obviously highly competitive, generally dominated by price comparison sites and big insurers. Typically, margins are generally pretty thin, and so the only way you're really going to be able to underwrite effectively is to use a data-driven approach, which, to be fair, is what most car insurers in the UK are doing, because it's the only way to really be competitive. And then in the front there, we've got a yacht, and yacht insurance is really interesting for two reasons. One is it's a hybrid between a high touch and a data-driven approach to underwriting. And what I mean by that is, in yacht insurance in the UK, there's companies who are doing a data-driven approach to yacht insurance, and then there's companies like the one that I helped start, which are doing a high touch or a light touch underwriting approach, where each risk is considered on its own merits. And I suppose the reasons we do our high touch or light touch model is that we're a new startup and we didn't have a huge volume of data to use to assess yachts on risks. There were certain factors we could know up front, sort of where is the yacht sailing and what activities it's doing. But unlike in car insurance, there's not a centralized database of that relates make of yacht, model of yacht, build type, build material, that sort of thing. And so all that knowledge is typically in the underwriter's head, and it's quite difficult to then extract that in a sensible structure and apply it into a more data-driven approach. But it's interesting for me because within one market, yacht insurance, was people underwriting yachts in very different ways, and ultimately they're both being successful. They're probably targeting different segments of the market, but they're ultimately being successful in what they do because they're profitable businesses generating an underwriting profit for insurers. Finally, on the right, a picture of Lloyd's, I'm sure you'll recognise. The reason I've included this is just the idea of a market. So if we think about car insurance in the UK, it's very high value overall relative to other lines of business, and also the average premium is very low, leading it to be, which really demands a data-driven approach if the average premium is so low. Comparing that to, say, yacht or horse insurance, the markets themselves are smaller, the average premium is probably a little bit higher, and so although it can tolerate probably a less data-intensive underwriting approach. So we've looked at the three different reasons why I think underwriting styles differ, and the one we'll just drill into in a bit more detail is data. So when we're talking about data-driven underwriting, what we're really talking about is using what people commonly call big data, because ultimately all underwriters, even those using a very high-touch underwriting approach, are data-driven, but they're probably not as data-driven as people in other lines of business like car insurance, for instance. So big data is typically considered to have three core features to it: volume, variety, and velocity. So starting with volume, the easiest one, it's really a question of how much data do you have. In this image, we've got MB, GB, TB, PB, which stands for megabyte, gigabyte, terabyte, petabyte, and they're just descriptions of size of data effectively. If you're in a niche line of business, it's quite hard to generate a sufficiently large data set to draw meaningful conclusions from it using a purely data-driven approach. Obviously, an underwriter can look at his book of business and make a good assessment of it, but to sort of automate that and adopt a more data-driven approach is quite challenging when you've got a small data set. So one of the key things that certainly my marine MGAs try to do is build bigger data sets so that they can make more informed decisions and start to move along that underwriting spectrum from the left towards the right. If we look at variety is actually probably, the variety and velocity are actually far more interesting than volume when it comes to big data. When we talk about variety of data, what we really mean is, how is it structured? Traditionally, data is only usable if it's in a structured format. And what we really mean, if it's in an Excel spreadsheet or a database, it's in a nice structured format that you can, first of all, access, extract it maybe into another system, and then interrogate to draw meaningful conclusions from. Interesting advances in technology, perhaps not that new, optical character recognition, or OCR. It's been around a couple of decades now, but that's probably one of the most interesting opportunities for businesses who've been around for 20 or 30 years, and especially if they've been running their business on paper for a long time, because there's probably an opportunity to take all those paper records and using sort of text analysis tools, turn that data into a structured document. So you could interrogate all your paper proposal forms, extract a load of data into a system about it, and then amalgamate that perhaps with data from your current system. And you can then, because you've then got a much larger data set, and I know this is one of the challenges that my first sort of insurance employer, Cavis, they had, was they had all this volume of paper, and actually they could draw some quite meaningful insights from it, if only they could put it into a sensible structure. The other opportunity is sort of down the machine learning route, is an opportunity to use unstructured data in its unstructured form to draw conclusions. So there's something called NLP, natural language processing, that could be used to do all sorts of things, quite interesting. Sentiment analysis is one, which is where it effectively gauges how people feel about, it could be a business or it could be a person. And that could then be scored, and you could use that to infer your underwriting decisions if reputation is a relevant factor to your underwriting. On the velocity side of things, what we're really talking about is moving from, I suppose we call it dead data, almost data that was captured, and then it's saved, but you collected it once and it's only really useful once. There's opportunities now, and it's again, car insurance has, I suppose, led the way, where there's car insurance companies offering pay-as-you-drive policies, which are effectively using real-time data, not only to infer how risky you are as a driver, but also then to price the risk and to package it into a useful product. So other opportunities of real-time data, satellite data is being more commonly used to offer real-time information on underwriting risks. Particularly useful for property, because property generally doesn't move around, unlike cars. So there's interesting opportunities to leverage these larger data sets, even if you don't have access to all that data within your own domain. So what I think most businesses will want to be doing is improving the data quality and quantity, improving the quality of data and the quantity. On the quality front, it's really input equals output. Collect good data to start with, and the output's then much better. If you're collecting rubbish up front, you're going to get rubbish out. And then there's a load of other things about storing it safely and making sure it's not corrupted. But ultimately, it really boils down to, in my opinion, how good is the data we're getting in through the front door. I think a good example of this is if you look at a lot of proposal forms, a lot of customers look at them and go, why do I have to answer all these questions? And I think one of the best efforts sort of underwriters to make is to look hard at their proposal forms and think really carefully about which questions matter and which don't. Because if you put a load of questions in front of people that generally they don't particularly recognise the relevance of, I think generally you'll get poor quality answers, which will reflect in your data quality. In terms of quantity, I think the key thing, if you're a business that's been around for a number of years, one of the best things you can do is to look at your data and go, can I actually access the data I already hold in my business in a sensible fashion? And then ultimately, can I analyse it? Because I know certainly from our experience dealing with our customers, lots of them have lots of data, but generally none of it's accessible. And if it's not accessible, it's not useful. It's just ultimately taking up space at someone's hard drive. So the first thing is taking that data, can you access it? What you probably then want to do is structure that data into a sensible format so that you can use it for for your intended purpose. Now, as underwriters, probably the first thing you want to be looking at is comparing your income and your claims and how that relates at a policy level. And then you can start analysing the aspects of each individual risk. And from that, you can develop models to predict claims. You can optimise your pricing more exactly. So it needs to be in a sensible structure to do that. Another key opportunity is enriching data. Data enrichment is not a new thing. There's quite a few companies in the UK doing it now. There's a real mix from the generalists who have a wide set of data to the specialists who are just dealing in one thing. The most simple data enrichment, and I always like to tell people this is a data enrichment, is actually a postcode lookup. A lot of people just take it for granted now. But postcode lookup is probably where it all starts. And it's really for a customer, it's the first part of a journey. A lot of time is what's your address, and having a postcode lookup is really key. There's some really interesting enrichment companies out there now that can just take your postcode and your address and tell you what your house is made of, how many bedrooms it's got, is it detached, semi-detached, and you can actually compress the customer journey doing that. For other more niche lines of business, data enrichment could be more challenging because generally data enrichment only exists for larger volumes of data. So generally, more mainstream insurances can be enriched. But one of the interesting opportunities, and I think we'll probably want to explore this further on our marine side, is using people's credit scores. And generally, everybody has a credit score, and there's a couple of different people providing credit scores. You can use that, and I think that would be one of the most interesting things to compare against claims, because certainly, I suppose, anecdotally, I feel that people that with better credit score are probably more careful as policyholders in what they do. So once you've accessed your data, structured it, enriched it, if you want to increase the size of your data set, you can then start to analyze it. I'm no expert by any means on data analysis, but I've done some very simple claims prediction tools using Excel. For me, as a sort of, I suppose, an underwriter, if you like, there's lots of resource online to start running your data and trying to generate your own sort of predictive analytics from it. And you don't need an actuary, and you don't need a data team. You know, if you're a business of 2 or 3 people running sort of an MGA, you can do this yourself if you have your data and if you can use Excel. So claims prediction is one, price optimization is another opportunity, and that, you know, you discover your trends when you're applying these things to your underwriting to improve ultimately the underwriting result. The last point there is timely response. What I really mean by that is there's no point collecting a load of data if you just don't have if you're not going to be looking at it sufficiently frequently to make it worth it. And what certainly I've seen in the past is that you don't keep up with your as claims increasing costs as your claim inflation kicks in, which has been particularly severe in the equine market, just as sort of technology has moved on with what vets can do using MRI machines, that sort of thing. Generally, the premium wasn't increasing in line with that opportunity or that claims cost. So you need to be acting on it regularly to make it worthwhile. So the other interesting thing you can do with data, I mentioned briefly there, is compressing the customer journey. What I really meant about that is making the customer journey shorter for your customers. Generally, a shorter customer journey will lead to less dropout. I think you'll probably also get better quality answers. You don't get, I suppose, what you might call proposal form fatigue, where people just give up trying to answer sensibly and just write rubbish in the forms. That's particularly true. It's probably most challenging in probably complex commercial lines where the proposal forms can be a lot bigger. And so any opportunity to compress that customer journey should probably be grabbed with both hands. Data enrichment, again, mentioned previously, that could be one of the key ways to do it, where the customer provides a little bit of information such as postcode, and then you can come back with a lot of information about themselves, so they can just go, oh yes, that's great, yes, that's great, no, it's slightly different, rather than asking them to input all that data themselves. Interrupting the customer journey, interesting point. So if you think about your referral criteria and your decline criteria, customers generally, if they're not going to be able to be insured with you, I think it's better to tell them sooner rather than later. And if you've got data about what you do or what you don't want to insure, or what will require being sort of manual or high touch underwriting rather than data driven approach, I think it's better to tell them sooner rather than later, because I think that just keeps everyone happy. And it also gives you more time to come back to the client with a sensible offer and explain to them perhaps why the policy, just as it is, isn't suitable, and perhaps a slightly different policy may be more suitable. And then on the upselling and cross-selling front, there's real opportunity, particularly for businesses who've got lots of data about their clients and typically probably haven't done much upselling or cross-selling, to use that data to identify clients who are likely to buy other products from you. In the horse world, the most obvious one was, if you've got horse insurance, you've probably got trader insurance as well, or horse box insurance. So it's pretty basic stuff, but it's a great opportunity to grow your book of business organically without the acquisition costs of chasing down new customers. Got a couple of case studies here, and this is based on my marine FGA experience. So the first one's marine trade insurance. So marine trade is insuring businesses in the marine market. So you've got boatyards, boat builders, mariners, all the way from the big end down to your man in a van who's sort of a freelance boat maintainer. So the picture here, this is of Monaco Marina, which some of you may or may not recognise. There's just some interesting ideas to draw from this about how to use data. Now, the first thing is what I was saying earlier about data enrichment. Flood, there's companies providing with flood data based on your postcode. Generally, with marine trade, most of the businesses are located on the sea or on a river. So generally, they're probably returning a very high risk for flood, which is interesting because a lot of people would then immediately refer that. And really, if you're going to go and insure businesses here, it is a manual approach, because you want to go and actually look at the infrastructure and go, well, I know it's at high risk of flood because it's next to the sea and next to a river. But a lot of the infrastructure will be built to cope with that in a way that your average commercial property or your house won't be. So for all the benefits of data enrichment, you need to combine it with an actual practical knowledge of your subject, really. The other thing is you've got the sort of the micro location, if you like, going, oh, it's on a river by the sea. You've then got, I suppose, the macro location, which in this case, this is in the Mediterranean. Typically, the weather is benign. They don't tend to get the big stormy conditions that we see Northwest Europe or the Atlantic. And so there's a lot of climate data to support an underwriting decision about the sort of macro location of a marine trade business that you don't get at sort of micro level, which I think is quite interesting when you're thinking about underwriting different types of businesses in sort of different niches. Looking at the yacht case study, which is the next one. So this is an image I took this morning of the wind in the North Atlantic. So over here, we've got the UK, and then North America, Florida down there, Caribbean, Mediterranean's over here. So as you can see, there's basically dark colours are bad, and red and black are bad, and then blue is light wind. So in the middle of the Atlantic, we've got a big low pressure system, which will probably hit the UK in the next few days. Now, the key thing with yachts is there's not a big database of yacht make versus yacht model. It just doesn't exist. The only people who've really got databases of that size are people who've been doing yacht insurance for probably a couple of decades, where they built sufficient database to support that kind of data structure. So it's quite difficult to underwrite on make and model in yacht unless you've got that data. But there are certain things we can underwrite quite competently on. The first one is really the location of a yacht. A yacht in the UK, if it's just sailing, sort of from the end of the UK, Land's End to Dover, it's relatively benign. It's near the shore all the time, so you can say pretty confidently, relative to a yacht that's crossing the Atlantic in the middle of March, it's a much safer risk, because you don't really want to be out in the middle of the Atlantic being confronted by these sorts of winds here when there's absolutely no shelter and you're relying entirely on the boat rather than being able to take shelter. sure you're all aware, hurricanes in the Caribbean. So if we're looking at, say, this hurricane map, looking at this map in the middle of UK summer, we'll probably be seeing a lot more wind in the Caribbean. So because we've got lots of climate data, we can underwrite quite confidently on yacht based on climate data, even though we probably don't know from a data point of view as much about the yacht as we might know about the car if it was, say, a car insurance policy. The other thing we can know about a yacht is what it's been used for. Generally, sailing yachts, two uses. Got a sort of leisure use, which is just going sailing for a afternoon, have a nice time, and then you got yacht racing. And typically, yacht racing is a much greater risk than leisure use, and so we can be quite confident rating on that factor from a data point of view. What I think is quite interesting is when we're doing our yacht insurance, we capture what type of racing people are doing. It sort of ranges from amateur to professional. From what we've seen, generally in terms of the risk of a yacht having an accident isn't hugely different on that spectrum of amateur to professional. But because we capture that data, we can use it to inform our underwriting. Although typically, if there is an incident, the likelihood is pretty much the same, but the severity is much higher when it's professional, just because the boat's more expensive. So talking about a possible future for niche lines, I suppose I describe it as hybrid underwriting, and ultimately what it boils down to is a mix of, it's about being at the appropriate place on that underwriting spectrum for the risk in question, generally as a class of risk, and for the specific risk that you're dealing with. And I suppose to me, what you want to try and do is give people a good client journey ultimately, and that will depend on the type of insurance that you're selling. But if you can start people down a sort of a compressed journey where they have to put in a minimal amount of information, enrich that journey for them so that you're giving them information rather than them giving you everything, and then interrupt that journey when they start to go astray, perhaps of the answers that they're giving, they're then falling outside of your data-driven underwriting criteria. Those policies, and hopefully they're the minority, can then come back down the underwriting spectrum towards more of a high-touch manual approach. And it may be that you can offer that customer a really good policy at the right price that they're happy with, based on their specific risk factors. So you haven't lost a customer just because computer says no, effectively. And then just to summarize, what you want to do to really achieve a hybrid approach is you need to get your data in good shape, be able to access it, put it in a good structure, enrich it if you need to give you sufficient quantity of data to work with, and then spend the time to analyze that data to draw relevant conclusions from it that can be useful in your business in a timely fashion. So make sure your pricing and your terms and conditions are correct, and you're accepting the right risks ultimately. And ultimately, the idea that AI is going to come along and replace us all, I think it's just not going to happen. What people are going to end up doing is they're going to move up the value chain and effectively be, as an underwriter, you'll be the one defining the rules that the data is operating around. And then you'll be dealing with these high-touch cases that fall outside the scope of those rules. So I think ultimately machine learning, AI will be supporting underwriters, not replacing them. So just to summarise the learning objectives, so we talked about the different styles of underwriting that exist on what I call the underwriting spectrum, from high-touch towards machine learning, artificial intelligence. We talked about why those different styles exist. It comes down to how much data have you got, what's the nature of the risk that you're dealing with, and what does the market that you operate in look like. And then we've looked at why some lines of business have historically been more data driven than others, and typically it's because they've had lots of data and the market's quite big and average premiums lower. That would be the three key reasons for me as to why certain lines of business have become very data driven. And then finally we've looked at how businesses who traditionally don't have a lot of data can leverage what data they do have and enrich it to develop a more of a data-driven approach, so that really, ultimately, underwriters can spend more time doing high-value tasks and less time doing administration. So thank you very much for your time. My name is Will Press, and I'm Product Manager at Paracode. If you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch.
Thank you for that, Will. Well done, given you weren't feeling on top form. And I have got a question, if I may put that to you. So as we move to more tech-led data collection, data enrichment, AI, etc., do you agree that we are moving further away from fair presentation of risk, so legislation will need to keep up?
The honest answer is I don't know. It's a very difficult question. I think from a legislative point of view, there's probably a lot of stuff's going to come out of consumer duty, but I think will perhaps guide that to a greater extent. Ultimately, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, that's a terrible answer. But
no, that's fair enough. You can't know everything. That's fine. Please feel free, delegates still on the line, to submit a question via the chat box. But what I wanted to ask yourself, Will, just while waiting to see if there's any other questions come in, if a member wanted to engage with Paracode, what would that initial engagement look like? How would the process start?
Thanks. So what we typically do is we come and have a chat, really, and our key thing, our sort of entire USP, I suppose, we're a service-led business with a technology package, effectively, and we like to compete on service rather than just competing purely on the features of the system. So we'll come talk to you, understand your business. We like to come to people's office to do it because I think it gives us a much better feel for how people do business. From that, we like to then provide a demo of our system. The way we like to do demos is if you give us one of your products to build, we'll build it in our system and demo it back to you so that you can see what it looks like. The next step is what we call, I suppose, fit analysis, which probably used to be called gap analysis, which is where we do a deep dive and look at any shortfalls in our system. How can we close those gaps so that what we deliver ultimately works for you? Because although we like to compete on the speed of which we can do things, ultimately there's no point being fast if the solution isn't right. Once we've done that, our model we describe as no code, no capex, no constraints. So the system's no code platform you can manage yourself. We absorb all the development costs of getting your product live. So any changes that are needed to our platform, we'll just swallow that, and you only pay when you're live. So effectively it's an OPEX cost rather than an upfront CapEx. I mean, no constraints just describes how hopefully the no code sort of construct allows people to create whatever products they want to do. And typically we've built mostly niche products to date because we're a relatively new company. And generally niche MGAs are less well served by technology than the mainstream.
Yeah. Okay.
Typically you spend most of the effort understanding how people do business, and that's what products you build, how they're underwritten, and how they're distributed. That's really the three key things.
Yeah. Okay. And this might well be a question, how long's a piece of string? So apologies in advance, but all things being equal, if you scheduled your first meeting to go into a business and understand how they operate through to first go live of the first product, is there a time frame that you would expect to be a reasonable time frame?
Yeah, so it does depend on those three things I just described: the product, the process, really, the underwriting process, and the distribution. If it fits within the box, I mean, we could get you live in a couple of days,
Wow.
Feasibly. But the reality is, every MGA we've encountered today is unique. It's unique for a reason, because that's how that MGA has competitive advantage. So, we would never want to do something quickly when we could do it better slowly. So,
yeah, quite right. Yeah.
And the other, I suppose, on the other hand, if you were already on our platform, we could get new products live within hours, and we have done that. And it's because the understanding already exists there between what you're doing, what products you're selling, how you're doing it. We understand that. So it just compresses that whole journey into, okay, just tell me about the product, tell me about the rating, tell me about all the structures. Okay, it's done. Here you go. Crack on. So, yeah.
Okay,
it does depend, though.
And then I think a question that often comes up, most supply members, is scalability. Are there any limits on scalability?
So in terms of the raw technical capability of the system, it's cloud-based. So there's not really a scalability issue there. Just more servers, effectively, or more DTUs, if anyone's familiar with Microsoft Azure. The key thing is does that understanding exist between the customer and ourselves? That's really the key limit to scalability. If we understand the customer's business, and it's a two-way thing. Customers think you pay the money and you get the system, happy days. It's mostly an investment in time is what you're really making to build that relationship as a customer, to explain to someone, how you do what you do, why you do it, why it's important. That's the real investment, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. We don't have any more questions. So unless there was anything else that you wanted to add, Will, or unless anybody had a question they wanted to very quickly drop into the chat, and we can still make the most of Will being on the call. If there's no further questions, I will just say thank you again to Paracode and to Will Prest for presenting to membership today. Really interesting. Very much appreciate your time. Thank you to our delegates for joining us, a really healthy turnout. So it's always good to see high numbers, A, for our suppliers who contribute a lot to membership, but B, because we know that we are delivering the right types of briefings to our membership. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a very productive afternoon, and please look out for the briefing survey that I would ask you to complete to give your feedback for today and going forward. Thanks very much. Good afternoon.